Kona has always been one of those brands that feels real, feels different, raw, rebellious, and built for the riders who just went out and want to shred. Today I'm sitting down with Jake. He's one of the original minds behind the Kona brand, and we're going to dig into a bit of the wild ride that went along with building a legendary mountain bike brand. Going to touch into some of what Jake got him into mountain biking, the bumps and joys along the way with Kona, and just get some insights on the industry today. This is Trail Nutz, the podcast from real riders with real stories about real trails. Thanks for joining me today, Jake.
That's my pleasure. Nice intro.
Thanks.
Very pro.
I always like to get a sense of my guest origins into mountain biking. Like, what got you into it? What was that moment you're like, I'm going to go do this thing?
Well, I have to admit that I got into cycling before there were even any mountain bikes. So I go back that far. And, I was a roadie, got into cyclocross as a winter sport. And so I like riding in dirt and mud. And really that was my introduction to riding in the dirt. And when I saw my first mountain bike, I recognized right away this was going to be a pretty big thing. I was working in a bike shop in Vancouver called West Point Cycles. And a friend of mine who was an engineer and had a little bike magazine on the coast, traveled to San Francisco frequently. And he had gone to Gary Fisher's bike shop in Fairfax, California. He bought a bike, a Ritchie mountain bike, because Gary Fisher and Tom Ritchie were together back in those days. And he brought it into the store and he said, look what I've got. And it is like pretty brilliant. And we'd been already converting all these cheap 10-speed bikes into useful commuter bikes. And everybody says like, hey, the seats hurt my ass. The handlebars are uncomfortable. I need lower gearing. I'd like to have wider tires. And I'm looking at a mountain bike and saying, this is like everything that people want. And, back then, BMX had just kind of been introduced. It had kind of arced high and then dropped. And so people were saying mountain biking was going to be a fad. And that happens a lot when a new category arrives. Like when we started making freeride bikes in the late 90s, people looked at it and said, like, that's one of the stupidest ideas I've ever seen. Like, who would want to ride a big, heavy bike? So, I think you just have to have an open mind when it comes to bikes and new ideas. I mean, some of them are real winner ideas and never make it. But it was pretty obvious to me mountain biking was going to be a big thing.
It was definitely the right, correct bet, in my opinion. I'm curious, in those early days from that transition, it was the 10-speed bikes, beefing them up. You had some burly commuter bikes. At what point, and I don't know if this was your origins were always in Vancouver, but when did real mountain bike trails start becoming part of the conversation?
Well, of course, it started in California, so they were using hiking trails and horse trails to do their riding. Vancouver City, well, it wasn't as built up then, but there's the area out on the west side up by the university called the University Endowment Land. That's where we first started riding. Lots of trails, hiking trails, and we would go there and ride our mountain bikes. I mean, we would ride our mountain bikes any possible place we could take them. We'd take them up the coast. We'd go on this ride that is kind of halfway between Vancouver and Whistler called Black Tusk, and that's a hiking trail. We actually were stupid enough to carry our bikes to the top of the peak just for the hell of it. Did a lot of kind of bushwhacking and pioneering back then. But it took about a year before I met the guys from the Cove Bike Shop, who were on the North Shore, and a legendary store, the first mountain bike only bike shop in Canada. And they introduced us to the trails there, which were all natural back then, of course. And so that was an eye-opener as well, because the terrain in British Columbia is extremely challenging. The trails now are just out of this world, of course. But it kind of expanded the whole idea of what mountain biking could be. So being here uh, really turned out to be the perfect place to launch a mountain bike company and to start developing bikes, because the terrain really kind of pushed us in the direction of creating a bike that was going to stand up in any weather conditions, on any kind of technical trail condition. So kind of right place, right time really worked out for us.
Yeah, it's there's so much that has come out of that region, not just across Canada being influenced, I think globally. Um, I remember in the early days when I first started hearing about Kona, I think they were around, but I have this very distinct memory of, I don't remember which mountain bike video it was, but it was something we had on in a shop that I was at, and I think it was Nelson, BC, and someone rode off of like a 2-story house onto a slope, and I was like, I don't know if I've ever seen that before, and that was the image instantly resonated with me. Like, that is what Kona is all about. I'm wondering, maybe give me some insight into what was the driving force, or what was that soul or vibe you were going for when you decided we're going to do Kona?
Um, well, I mean, I'm a lifer in the bike business. I was telling you, was working in a bike shop, and I was started working there to put myself through the University of British Columbia, where I was studying all kinds of useless stuff, and working in the bike shop. And after a couple of years of college, they said, "Well, would you like to be the head mechanic?" Um, so I called up my mom and said, "Hey, I'm going to drop out of college and work in the bike shop for a while." She wasn't impressed, but it worked out. But the whole so it's sort of a continuum. Having the bike shop, and I eventually became part owner in a chain of stores. And we got really interested in kind of increasing the level of quality product that was being offered, because back then, a lot of cheap 10-speed bikes, there'd been at this 10-speed bike boom in the early 70s, and a lot of crappy bikes out there. I mean, really, adjusting derailleurs with, basically a hammer and a crowbar. They were so crude. Crank arms were being installed with cotter pins to hold them in place. I mean, it was definitely backwoods stuff. So as we got into more and more sophisticated bikes, and then started discovering what mountain bikes were, the chain of stores was very fundamental in the foundation of Rocky Mountain Bicycles, which I was part of for a few years. And that didn't work out for me, but I had met my business partner at Kona in the bike shops. We'd worked together in the bike shops, and he was at Rocky Mountain Bicycles as well with me. And when that fell apart, we decided to do our own thing. And I had this 2-year period where I went down to California and I worked for Tom Ritchie for a little while, and then had this really bizarre period working for Marin Bikes, which turned out to be extremely fortuitous. Sorry, I'm being just super rambly here, but I'll get to the point. So at Marin is where I met Joe Murray, and not everybody remembers Joe, but Joe was sort of the legendary mountain bike racer of the early days in California. He was winning just about all the races. And he's one of the inaugural members of the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame. And he was working for Gary Fisher and Gary Fisher's bike shop. And then he ended up working at Marin Bikes, designing their bikes at the same time I was there. And it was a pretty weird period. But at one point I said to Joe, like, we should do our own bikes. And my buddy Dan started this company up in Vancouver to distribute bikes. So how about if you join us? So that was kind of the origins of Kona in 1988. And we were very focused on doing hardtail steel, obviously, because there were no aluminum mountain bikes at that stage. That were very focused on performance, kind of cross-country racing. we put together this design that at that time was kind of, well, maybe it's evolutionary with the sloping top tube and the small rear triangle, because all the road bike companies were making bikes with conventional, double diamond frames that looked like road bikes, but had 26-inch wheels. So that really was the origin. And that was kind of our thing for a while. We dabbled in trying other categories of bikes, because, we were interested in every kind of bike, not just mountain bikes. It just happened to be that you couldn't sell anything other than a mountain bike in those days. Like, road biking was kind of dead. There wasn't really anything exciting happening. So it was, just trying to be a commercially viable business. And then as the trail started to become more and more technical on the North Shore, we realized that cross-country bikes just were not going to cut it on those kind of trails. And there were some pretty steep stuff that people started riding on, and still natural terrain, but kind of that sort of evolved into, for us, a bike that needed to be a lot burlier, needed to have bigger tires, needed to have longer travel, essentially needed to be overbuilt so that people didn't bust things and didn't kill themselves. And so sort of concurrent free ride, downhill, it's kind of all happening around that time. And as we got more and more into it, that whole free ride movement really started to take hold in cycling. And the North Shore was kind of the origin point for that. So again, like, right place, right time. It just worked out for us. And then we met Derek Westerland, who was making those videos that you're probably referenced, the New World Disorder series.
It may have been the New World Disorder series. No,
there was some stuff before that, North Shore Extreme, because, that's when people like Digger started making these man-made trails with woodwork. And that started upping the game, obviously, for mountain biking. And, we had to respond to it by building bigger and stronger and burlier bikes, which was super fun. And then Derek Westerland came along with his production company and started making these videos. And that's when free riding just completely went off the rails. And we had those bikes, the Stinkies, and, then we couldn't make them fast enough. We were far enough ahead of what everybody else was doing that, it was great. We made them and sold them, and it was just a commercial sensation as far as we were concerned. And in the meantime, we're hanging out with these badass free riders and having some really wild adventures.
It's a brand that's definitely everywhere. I was on a family vacation to the Maritimes this past summer, and I was in Charlottetown, PEI, and I saw two kids that were probably 13 or 14 years old ripping around a parking lot in a grocery store with full face helmet on. I don't know which Kona model it was, but they were both on Kona bikes. I was like, oh, where's the mountain in Charlottetown? Like, I lived there years ago. There's no mountains in Charlottetown, but just people wanting to be a part and associated with that whole movement. I think it's really, even in my younger days, I had aspirations to go and do that. We got part way there. I still like to ride, but I don't do anything too crazy. But it's very infectious. It looks like the guys are having fun in those videos. The trails look amazing. The bikes look like, who doesn't want one, right? So
yeah, and sorry, keep going.
Go.
Yeah. What you're saying, like, iconic brand. Well, actually, we didn't even know we had a brand for the longest time. We're just making bikes and thought we had a bike company, and we're just making stuff up as we were going along, and we were getting into trouble for some of it. We had like scratch and sniff tires. We had some bikes called Sex. We did some kind of questionable promotions and advertising. And it was kind of deliberate too, right? Like, when you're small and there's a lot of big players around you, you have to make some noise for people to notice you. So that's what we were doing, and sort of apologized for anybody that goes back and looks at some of that reprehensible material we put out there. We've cleaned up our act since then, I think. So, the whole concept has always been to enjoy our work, to travel around the world and meet people. So we really spread it thin. And again, good timing, right? When we started, Europeans were just starting to discover mountain bikes. And so all the cyclists over there who were discovering it, we reached out to them. We did trade shows over there and met people who were into it. And that really helped to build the business, but it also gave us the opportunity to travel the world and kind of spread ourselves completely around the globe. And we weren't intending to be a global brand. We were just kind of having a good time riding bikes and meeting people, and really stayed that way for the longest time.
Was the culture as Kona was growing? Like I get the sense that you, as one of the founders, riding was a big part of your culture. Is that ingrained across the company? Has it always been that way? Like you're working at Kona, you like to ride bikes.
Yeah, maybe to a fault. There are admin people and stuff like that maybe are not so bike crazed as the rest of us. But let's take the example of a long-term employee called Dick Cox, who is kind of a legendary salesperson. He just kind of goes and hangs out with people at the bike shop and rides with them. If their fence needs to be painted, he'll help them paint the fence. If their car needs to be washed, he'll help them do with that. He just kind of hangs out with people and rides bikes and gets a big fat order for the company. But that's kind of the style. The reps go on the road, they meet people, they kind of interact and learn what's happening on the ground. They bring it back home again. So it's this cross-cultural thing that's constantly occurring that kind of makes the work enjoyable. There's lots of brands and companies that started after we did and have become way bigger than we ever have been, even at our peak in the pandemic. And it's really because we didn't want it to get to the point where it's so big that we didn't know all our staff, we didn't know all our customers, we didn't know all our suppliers. We always wanted to have that personal connections, which unfortunately the people that bought our company really wanted at the end of 2021, really wanted to turn it into more of a transactional type of business, cutting edge, modern business, doing direct to consumer stuff. And it just sucked all the personality out of the company and the brand. Luckily, it didn't destroy it because they only had it for 2.5 years.
And I don't know if everyone knows that. I know you and your business partner stepped away for, like you said, a couple of years, and it's fairly recently that you are back at the helm. Now that you are back and it is independently owned, what excites you for the future of Kona?
Same thing that's always excited me, Mark, is bikes. Developing, creating bikes, kind of pushing the proverbial envelope. So taking something that's happening in cycling and, like I was saying, doing this kind of cross-cultural interchange where you meet people and you learn what they're doing with their bikes. Like people buy a bike and they don't keep it the same as what it was off the rack. They're always modifying and adapting a bike to their conditions. And that's what we like to do. We'll take a category. Like we introduced a gravel bike last year called the Ouroboros, which is more like a mountain bike than a gravel bike. So it's kind of pushing that whole concept of a drop bar road bike and making it a machine that can do a lot more than a conventional gravel bike. And so we've done that. The free ride bike was a good example. That was really just a matter of adapting a bike to be what people were doing. Ouroboros is an example of coming up with something that is what people are doing, but it's maybe a little bit counter to what the conventional thinking is. And that's what excites us, is coming up with new ideas. I know it's kind of a thing in cycling now, is to come up with really kooky stuff, and just, throw it out there and see if it works. I mean, we do that all the time. So that's really the enjoyment, that kind of discovery of new ideas, testing it out, seeing if it works, and then putting it on the market and hoping that you don't blow up.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, in the case of the Ouroboros, it's turned out to be like way more popular than we ever expected.
Yeah, on the topic of gravel bikes, do you see that as a fad, or do you think that's going to keep growing, much like mountain biking did?
Well, we made our first gravel bike in 2014. And essentially, we took a cyclocross bike, which was kind of a thing for us for the longest time. It was kind of an interesting movement, and really still is in cycling. But again, making the bike burlier and more adaptable for other kinds of riding. So if it's been around for 10 years, I don't think it's going to be a fad. Where it evolves, is the exciting part, because it's sort of going in two directions. There's the competitive side where people are doing 100-mile races and killing themselves. And then there's the adventure side, which is like the Ouroboros that we started making last year. So there's all these little niches and interesting categories that really appeal to someone who is an enthusiast and just loves bikes, regardless of what the category is. And I used to think I was an outlier there. We go back far enough with an open mind, but I think a lot of people now are more willing to experiment in different kinds of cycling. So to answer your question, no, I don't think gravel is a fad. I mean, if you took a gravel bike and you compared it to a mountain bike from sometime in the late 80s, it's almost the same thing. It's a fully rigid bike with drop bars and fat tires. Yeah, so it's interesting how things just keep evolving and changing in cycling.
It's a very versatile bike too. I was watching some reels on one of the social channels earlier today, and there was a guy that was riding it technical single track, hitting jumps on his gravel bike. I was like, that's wild. I'm not doing that, but good for you. I agree. I don't think it's a fad. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it was probably great to get more people into riding that style of a bike. So you talked a little bit about putting out, you called it kooky ideas, into seeing what sort of sticks. The spaghetti test, maybe that's what that is. What are some of the things you see coming in for the bike industry? Like, what do you think? What's cooking right now?
I think the biggest focus kind of on the industry level probably is e-bike development, making motors that are more robust, more reliable, have longer range, so and lighter. So that's interesting, I think, because it opens cycling to a wider audience. And I know there are the purists out there who think e-bikes don't belong, but they're here to stay, and I think they're totally valid. And without getting into too much of an argument, I would say, okay, if you think e-bikes don't exist, tell me you never ride to the trailhead. Tell me you would not take a lift to the top of the mountain in a bike mart. So I think they're totally valid. That's really where I think a lot of development is happening, whether it's mountain or trail or commuter. I think that's really expanding the bike world. I mean, we have some kind of questionable e-bikes on the market right now, and I think as governments start to regulate it a little bit harder, we'll start to eliminate that weird stuff that scares people away from e-bikes. But yeah, I think that's really where it's happening. And maybe you would not use an e-bike all the time, but there's certainly a time and place for almost anyone to have one and enjoy it.
I think you're right. As they focus on bringing that weight down, making the motors more efficient, you'll see more of an adoption. Uh, I know when I was shopping for my bike a couple of years ago, my newest one, the way it was described to me is, you live in an area where there's lots of trails, but there's people that come here that don't. And they come here and it's so taxing in their body, but they come and they ride an e-bike and they can go have some great enjoyment for a couple of hours, as opposed to riding for a couple of hours and then being out for the next week and a half while they're recovering. So it's great
Right.
for, like you say, accessibility of the sport. So it's good that way. Um, and interesting. I always like to try to wrap up with a couple standard questions, Jake. So I'm going to throw them over to you. And the first one, thinking of all the bikes you've ever had, what was your favorite ride of all time?
Bike or, yeah, bike.
Bike first, and then we'll talk trails after.
Well, my favorite bike is one that we haven't released yet. So I can't talk about it or the marketing
Okay,
department will kill me.
so
But it's a
we'll
gravel
defer that.
bike. It's a gravel bike that is on the performance side. Again, like I told you, my background is road racing.
Mhm.
So I like a bike that is pretty snappy, um, but has kind of a comfortable resilience to it. So this thing, I'll ride it on the road. It's not a fast road bike, obviously, but it is a fast gravel bike. It's total gravel worthy. I'm really excited about what's going to happen when we introduce it because it'll, I think, firmly establish us in a category that we have been a bit weak in. So yeah, that's probably my favorite bike. Although I have to say that's kind of an unfair question. It's like asking a dad who his favorite kid is,
Yeah, I know.
because
That's
I mean, we've made we've made a few bad bikes over the years, but I still love them. I will talk about them and all their flaws forever.
for sure. I'm just trying to think. There's a follow-up question there. Maybe I do have one. Thinking of the line and the evolution, is there one bike that Kona has put out, and you're just like, yes, like this is our identity. We're gonna mold around that. Is there anyone that really stuck out
This
over
might
the years?
surprise you. That might surprise you. We have periodically made a cruiser bike over the years. Like we'll make like 100 or 200. And
Yeah.
it's a twin top tube bike with straight tubes. It's not curved like your classic Southern California or Florida cruiser called the Huma Humu Nuku Nuku Apua'a, which is the name of the state fish of Hawaii. And as you know, the Kona name comes from there. And it is just a great town bike, a single speed bike, simple. It's steel. It's easy to make. It's going to last a really long time. It's super easy to maintain. The parts are not weird. You can find replacement parts for it. So that's, in my view, like that's an iconic bike. And you're going to ask Kona people or bike people, like, what is the most iconic bike for Kona? And you're going to get a whole bunch of different answers. But yeah, I think that for me is the bike. And of course, we're going to introduce another one eventually now that we have the reins back in our hands and turn out another one that'll have another interesting twist on creators.
Awesome. That is unexpected. Um, Jake, my final question for you. I always like to touch on this as it is a mountain biking podcast.
Yeah.
Similar vein, thinking of all the trails you've ever written, is there one that really stands out? You're like, that was an awesome trail, most memorable trail.
Well, the the trails, you know, around on the North Shore are really challenging and really tough. The one that was iconic for me, the real name of it is the Good Samaritan, but they called it the Severed Dick, with certain implications. So that one, for me, when I was starting to ride the North Shore more frequently, to me, that was kind of a tipping point. So that's I think why it's a favorite trail of mine. I mean, nowadays people look at it, it's pretty steep, but look at it and say, well, that's easy. I could ride that thing on my commuter bike. So it's hard to pick one. I mean, it's almost like you would say, my favorite trail is the one I'm going to ride today. Like, I don't really care if it's hard or not. I just want to go out and ride my bike and have a good time. So I know that's kind of a wishy-washy answer, but sort of it's like one or the other. What's meaningful to you, like over a long period of time, or what's meaningful for you today? And so I think it's just about getting out and riding, and that's really what Kona is all about, the long, sweet ride.
Nice. Good. That's a good answer. It's like when someone asks, what's your favorite song? Well, it depends on my mood right now. That was a great conversation, Jacob. I really enjoyed hearing some of the origins of Kona, your story, some of the fun names behind the bikes, where that kind of came from. Thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow Trail Nutz on your favorite podcast platform, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, more. We're everywhere. Just search for Trail Nutz or hit the link in our bio. And hey, if you've got a great mountain bike story and you want to be a guest, please reach out. We'd love to have you. Thanks for listening. Now go ride your bike. See you next time. And that's it. It takes a